The Prosecutors is brought to you by Progressive, where drivers who save by switching save over $700 on average. Quote now at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates, national annual average insurance savings by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2020 and May 2021. Potential savings will vary.
Do you want to know what it's like to hang out with MS-13 in El Salvador? How the Russian mafia fought battles all over Brooklyn in the 1990s?
Or what about that time I got lost in the Burmese jungle hunting the world's biggest meth lab? Or why the Japanese Yakuza have all those crazy dragon tattoos? I'm Sean Williams.
And I'm Danny Gold. And we're the hosts of the Underworld podcast. We're journalists that have traveled all over, reporting on dangerous people and places. And every week, we'll be bringing you a new story about organized crime from all over the world.
We know this stuff because we've been there, we've seen it, and we've got the near misses and embarrassing tales to go with it. We'll mix in reporting with our own experiences in the field, and we'll throw in some bad jokes while we're at it.
The Underworld podcast explores the criminal underworlds that affect all of our lives, whether we know it or not. Available wherever you get your podcasts.
I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors. Today on The Prosecutors, a woman dies and her family discovers she had a dark secret, one they never could have expected. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I'm Brett, and I'm joined, as always, by my energetic co-host, Alice.
It's the opposite of what I told you to call me, which was sleepy, because I'm so sleepy. But I am here, and
she is here,
sitting upright as of now.
And she's going to bring the fire. You're never going to know. You're never going to know that she's sleepy Alice.
Well, it's one of those situations where you've been sleep deprived for so long that when you finally get a normal amount of sleep, your body's like, oh no, now I just was reminded how tired I am. So I got a ton of sleep, but I'm so tired.
I know, it's ironic. It's like the more you sleep, the more tired you feel. But, well, our trial is over. It lasted a full 4 weeks, but it is over. And in the end, we were victorious. Can't really go into much detail about it. It's not our place, but justice was served, and we had a great experience. Alice gave a killer closing that sealed the deal. But now we're back to being full-time podcasters. So we've been neglecting you guys for a while, but no more until the next trial.
Full-time podcasters with a full-time job still, but no longer full-time in trial.
Right. Trial, which takes up every minute of your day. So, I don't know. If we had trials like that on a regular basis, we just wouldn't do this podcast. It just wouldn't be possible. I don't think you can really have trials like that on a regular basis because it was the culmination of a several-year-long investigation. But I'm glad we did it, but I'm glad it's over.
I'm really glad we're on this side. We never thought we'd be talking to you from this side of the mountain, so I'm glad that we made it over that. And now we get to dive into some more stories, because here's the thing. I typically don't like to read true crime novels late at night in bed because I get scared. But throughout trial, that seemed to be the only way to get my cortisol levels down, was to read very stressful murder mysteries. So I'm here for it.
There you go.
I am here for
Alice is fired up. Yeah. Well, that's exciting. Well, we have a story for you today that could be fiction, but is true. It's one of those stranger than fiction, crazy, can't believe it happened. It's a story that, honestly, I don't think gets covered that much. I've heard it on a couple shows, but not a lot. But it is amazing, and it ties into so many different true crime stories that we've shared with you before, that it's one we definitely wanted to talk about, and that is the life and death of Laurie Ruff. And before we get into this story, Alice, I have a story that I want to tell you that I feel like ties into this. If you will humor me, I have a little story to tell you.
You know how I feel about your stories. I will always listen.
Well, good. Well, this is not one that I can claim credit for. It's sort of a legend, an urban legend, but a classic one going back hundreds of years. And it's the story of the Black Velvet Band, or the Green Ribbon, depending on the story and depending on the teller and the time. The actual material and color of the material may vary, but we're going to go with the Black Velvet Band for this telling of the story. So here's how the story goes. And this isn't a riddle, I promise. This is just a story.
Go ahead. Let's just say that 75% of our listeners are psychopaths. So there you go.
Right, exactly. That's the purpose of the story. If you figure out what's going to happen by the end, then you're a psychopath. Anyways, okay. So there is this man, and he lives in a small town, a nice little village where everybody knows everybody. He's a single guy. And, he's looking to get married. He's looking to find somebody. But frankly, there's just no one in the town that really sparks his interest. And then one day, a stranger comes to town, a beautiful young lady. And as soon as he sees her, he falls madly in love with her. And there's just one thing that he notices that's a little strange. And that's no matter when he sees her, whether it's at church or at the market or late at night at dinner, she is always wearing a black velvet band around her throat. And she wears it no matter what else she's wearing. So she can be wearing, a white dress or a green top, and it just doesn't matter. She always wears this black band, but he's so taken with her that it doesn't matter. He starts to date her. They go out on a lot of dates. They're falling in love, and finally he feels confident enough to ask her about the band. And she says, I don't really want to talk about it. And he says, well, can you take it off for me? It's kind of weird that you're always wearing it. And she says to him, you'll be sorry if I do, so I won't. And he's like, okay, that's fine. I'm not going to ask any more questions. And they continue to date, and they fall in love. And finally he asks her to marry him, and she says yes. So the day comes. He's waiting there at the altar. Here she comes walking down the aisle in this beautiful white wedding dress. And she's still wearing this black velvet band around her throat. And he thinks that's really strange. And everybody from the town who's at the wedding is kind of looking at her, and they're thinking, that's really weird that she's wearing that. But whatever, he's in love. And so he ignores it. They get married, they're living their lives together. And now that they're living together, he realizes she never takes this thing off, ever. No matter what else she's wearing or not wearing, she's always wearing the black velvet band. And whenever he asks her to take it off, she always says, you'll be sorry if I do, so I won't. And it begins to eat at him to the point that he becomes obsessed with this black velvet band. And no matter how much he loves her, he can't get over it. And he decides he's got to take it off. So one night she falls asleep. She's wearing the black velvet band, and he goes and he gets a pair of scissors out of the drawer, and he walks up to her, and as quietly and as gently as he can, he slips the scissors in between her skin and the black velvet band, and he snips it off. And as soon as he removes the band, off her head rolls, and she's dead.
It's terrible. Goodness.
And in some versions of the story, her head rolls off and she just repeats over and over again, you'll be sorry if I do. You'll be sorry if I do. You'll be sorry if I do. In other versions of the story, they live their entire lives. She's on her deathbed, and he's like, can I finally take off the band? And she's like, yes. And he cuts the band off and her head falls off. But either way, her head falls off. So, this is a story that's been told for hundreds of years. It's a classic legend. And you may be wondering, why am I telling you this story at the beginning of our discussion of Laurie Ruff? And the reason is this is a story of two people who fell in love, but one of them had a secret that no matter how much her husband wanted her to share it, she would not tell him. And when he found out, it shattered everything that he had known about her. Maybe not as much as if her head had fallen off when he took off her black velvet band, but still in a dramatic way. So with that, let's talk about Laurie Ruff.
So when Blake Ruff met Laurie Kennedy at a church Bible study, he was immediately smitten. It wasn't long before he introduced her to his family. They were eager to meet the woman they'd heard so much about, and they began to ask her questions. Where was she from? Who were her parents? Where had she gone to school? The kinds of questions any family might want to know about the woman in their son's life. But Laurie wasn't answering. She was evasive, quiet. Her parents were dead, she said. She had no siblings, no other family. Well, did she have pictures? No, she burned them. Her past was something she wanted to forget. It was strange, but the Ruff family tried to respect her privacy. If their son loved her, they'd deal with her eccentricities. And it wasn't long before Blake asked Laurie to marry him. She agreed, but she had conditions. Blake could never ask her about her past. They couldn't even have a wedding announcement, and he could never look in the lockbox she kept in her closet. Blake agreed. But marital bliss lasted only a few years. Laurie grew more and more insular, more paranoid. Blake filed for divorce, and soon after, Laurie killed herself. Blake tried to move on, tried to understand what had happened, but when he opened a lockbox in his ex-wife's closet, he realized that the only thing he knew about Laurie was that he didn't know anything about her at all. We've got a very different kind of sponsor for this episode, The Jordan Harbinger Show, which is a podcast you really should be listening to. And I know that every day somebody tells you that you just have to listen to some podcast, and you nod and say sure, and then you never listen to it. Don't let that happen here. Jordan's show, which Apple named one of its best of 2018, is aimed at making you a better informed, more critical thinker so you can get a sense of how the world actually works and come to your own conclusions about what's happening even inside your own brain.
Each episode is a conversation with a different, fascinating guest, and when I say there's something for everyone here, I really mean that. In one episode, Jordan talks to a hostage negotiator from the FBI who offers techniques on how to get people to like and trust you, which sounds useful and disturbing at the same time. And there are many episodes that are going to appeal to you. For instance, Jordan interviews Amanda Knox, the subject of one of the most egregious false accusations in recent years, and Sammy the Bull Gravano. If you're interested in knowing how the mob works, that is an episode you cannot miss. So, we really enjoy this show, and we think you will as well. Search for The Jordan Harbinger Show. That's HARB as in boy, IN as in Nancy, GER on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. That's The Jordan Harbinger Show.
I know this is a topic that a lot of women cringe at talking about, but we shouldn't, because for women who suffer from any of the broad range of peri- and post-menopausal symptoms and who want safe and effective non-drug solutions they can trust, you are in luck, because Bonafide creates proprietary natural medical products that have earned the uncompensated recommendation of over 8,300 doctors to their patients on an ongoing basis. Bonafide was created to give women an alternative to effectively relieve the symptoms that accompany hormonal fluctuations within our bodies, because every woman deserves relief without compromise. If you have symptoms that occur throughout all of our lives, from PMS to menopause and everything else along the way, then check out Bonafide.
Give Bonafide a try today. No hormones and no prescription is required. Like Alice said, get real relief without compromise, and you can get 20% off your first purchase when you subscribe to any product, and up to 56% when you subscribe to multiple products by going to hellobonafide.com/prosecutors and use promo code Prosecutors. That's Hello Bonafide, BONAFIDE.com/prosecutors and code Prosecutors, PROSECUTORS, for up to 56% off at checkout. Kind of like the guy with the band. You see why I did the story, right? It's not entirely crazy. Yeah.
I see what
so
you
everybody
did.
Who's like already writing their mean Apple reviews about the story, just know there was a reason for it. So there. Anyways, so let's talk about the timeline in this case. And I promise you, eventually we're going to tell you more about Laurie. But we have to, in order to tell that story, we have to back up all the way to 1988. So on May 20th, 1988, an unknown woman obtains a copy of the birth certificate of Becky Sue Turner from the Kern County, California registrar. A little less than a month later, on June 16th, 1988, this same Becky Sue Turner walks into an Idaho DMV and obtains an Idaho driver's license. On July 5th, 1988, once again, just a little less than a month later, Becky Sue Turner shows up in Dallas with her driver's license and with her birth certificate. She goes to a Dallas, Texas courthouse and she requests a name change. She no longer wants to be Becky Sue Turner. Now she wants to be known as Laurie Erica Kennedy. On July 12th, 1988, 7 days later, with this new name in hand, she applies for a new Social Security card, one that will have her new name on it, and sure enough, she receives it. Now, with that Social Security card, she gets herself a Texas driver's license. It says she is 19 years old, and now with a driver's license and a Social Security card, she's able to get a U.S. passport. And Laura Erica Kennedy is as much a person as anyone else in this country, anyone else who was born here and had that name forever. Laura Erica Kennedy, as far as anyone knows, is this woman who used to be Becky Sue Turner. Now, with her new name and all her documentation, she gets a GED. She enrolls in a local community college. In 1997, she will graduate from the University of Texas at Arlington with a degree in business administration. So this is about 10 years after she walked into that California office looking for a copy of the birth certificate for Becky Sue Turner. So 7 years later, she's living in Texas. She has herself a job. She started going to church. And at this Bible study, she meets Blake Ruff. And eventually, in January of 2004, they get married. And she changes her name to Laurie Ruff. For the next 4 years, things are pretty normal. As Alice said, she's not talking a lot about who she is. She doesn't want to tell any of her family about her past, and Blake defends her. He says, look, whatever happened in the past, it doesn't matter. I love her now. If there are things she doesn't want to relive, we should respect that. Not everybody has a great life. Not everybody has a great family. Not everybody wants to remember their family. So he's very defensive of her. And things are fine, even though the past is something she doesn't want to talk about until they have a daughter. And at this point, if Laurie had been paranoid before, if she had been protective about her past, now she takes that to a whole nother level. She becomes incredibly paranoid and protective of her little girl, to the extent it starts to drive a wedge between her and Blake. She won't let her in-laws keep the baby. she really doesn't even want to let them hold the baby. She wants the baby with her at all times. She always seems like she's worried that if she lets that little girl out of her sight, she might disappear or someone might do her some harm. Within 2 years, the marriage that had started off with so much hope and you know, the pregnancy that had added to that, now they're going to have a family, it begins to fall apart. In 2010, Blake moves out and he files for divorce. And in the weeks that follow, Laurie's paranoia begins to seem threatening. The Ruff family starts getting threatening emails from Laurie, and they become suspicious that she is trying to break into their house. Fast forward to December 24th, 2010, Christmas Eve. Laurie pulls her car into the driveway of her in-laws' house. What exactly her intentions were is unclear. She sits in that car for some time, but after some period of time, she pulls out a gun and she uses it to shoot herself. After her death, her family goes through her things to try and discover what led to this descent into paranoia that eventually ended in Laurie's suicide. And they do find 2 letters, one made out to her husband and the other made out to her daughter to be opened on her 18th birthday. Obviously, given the situation, nobody waits. The police open both, but unfortunately, they reveal nothing. They are incoherent ramblings. They provide almost no clarity whatsoever, and they certainly provide no explanation as to what was going through Laurie's mind in those last few days and weeks. So her husband does the one thing she told him never to do. He breaks into her lockbox.
Oh, that's so tragic and so sad. I mean, to leave behind so few answers. I would probably do the same. Try and find out more. Well, there was more to find out, because after prying open the lockbox, they were stunned to find a number of unusual items. They also found a piece of paper with notes scribbled across it. Several caught people's eyes. The number for the North Hollywood police in the 1980s, but it's misspelled instead. N. Hollywood, spelled Hollooyood, 402 months, and the number for a lawyer in Los Angeles named Ben Perkins. The name of the police station and the 402 months notation led some to believe that Laurie had done something to earn a hefty prison sentence that she was running from. But there were a few problems with this. First, Laurie's fingerprints were not in the system. Given that they would have been added to databases if she were arrested, this seemed to rule out the crime theory, because even if she changed her name, her identity, when you are processed for prison, you are fingerprinted. All 10 of your fingers are fingerprinted, the palm included, and it's usually put into a national database so that anyone can see it again if you're on the run, if there's a hit for another conviction. So she can't run from that in terms of changing her name. Moreover, if Laurie had been convicted and sentenced for a crime that would land her in jail for more than 30 years, that's 402 months, she wouldn't have just been out on the streets. She would have had to escape custody, which obviously would leave quite a trail. And the reason we say that is if you got such a hefty sentence, you'd be detained most likely as soon as the sentence were imposed, meaning you'd be in custody. There's not any lead time where you get to turn yourself in at a later time, which may be the case if it were a non-violent crime where there is no reason to believe you would flee. But with a hefty sentence of 402 months, they wouldn't take that chance. They would take you directly into custody. And if you escape from anyone's custody, that will be well documented because you will be a fugitive. And depending on the jurisdiction that's looking for you, you will be sought after until you are found. Then there's Ben Perkins. Perkins is an African-American lawyer in Los Angeles. He caters to minority clients, and by caters, I mean that's his entire career. He's actually never had a white client. He has no recollection of Laurie under any of her identities, and she is a white female. And he has no idea why she had written down his phone number. In addition, there are several other phone numbers, as well as a notation that says simply, capital V's, capital I's, these eyes. That notation is next to a number that is apparently connected to a photography studio in Hollywood. That's a lot of strange information. I know I take notes, and notes don't always mean something to someone else, but these are all specific numbers, specific places, specific phone numbers tied to real places that seemingly have no connection to either Laurie or to each other.
Yeah, the 402 months thing really jumped out to me, too, just because typically when you're sentenced based on months, not... I mean, it depends on the jurisdiction, but, you know, a lot of times we think of people getting 5 years in prison or 10 years in prison. Well, often you are sentenced based on months. So 402 months is a sentence you could get. Like Alice said, 360 months is 30 years. So that's another almost 5 years on top of that, I guess. 4 years on top of that, a little less. I mean, that's a long sentence. I mean, that's the kind of sentence you get when you're a big-time drug dealer. You know, when you're moving a lot of cocaine, you might get 402 months. And like Alice said, if you're going to get a sentence like that, you're not going to be out on the street. You're going to be... The fingerprint thing is really important. And I know this is a popular theory that there's some sort of crime going on here, but Laurie's fingerprints would have been in the system as soon as she was arrested for any crime. She would be fingerprinted. It's one of the first things they do. After you're arraigned, one of the first things they do, they take your fingerprints. Even if they release you, even if you're released, they're going to take your mugshot and they're going to take your fingerprints. And none of that happened. So there's no telling what this number means. It is strange that it's next to the police department number. It's strange that it's next to the name of a lawyer, one that she's never met. And you know, as we talked about when we were telling the story, Laurie obviously had some paranoia issues towards the end of her life. One wonders if perhaps she had some other mental health issues at other times that would have led to this scribbling. We said there were some other unusual things in the box. Those things included some forged recommendation letters. So she had forged some letters from people that she had supposedly worked for, saying what a great employee she was and how highly she came recommended. So there were things in the box that helped her develop this identity. There was also the birth certificate we talked about and the former IDs for this Becky Sue Turner person. So I mean, you can just imagine you open this thing up and you see this stuff if you're her husband and you're seeing names that you never have heard of. You're seeing things that are obviously forgeries. You're seeing this letter that is, you can spend a lot of time on this. It reminds me of the Ray Rivera. When we talked about Ray Rivera and there was that letter that they found or note or whatever, it's hard to say exactly what it was, that had a lot of different things written on it. And people spent a lot of time trying to break that down and figure out exactly what was on the note and exactly what it meant. You can do the same thing with this note. You can find this note. We'll post it on the website. There's a lot of notations. People have figured out what a lot of it means, but not why it's relevant to Laurie. So a lot of strangeness going on here. And that brings us to Becky Sue Turner. We talked about how this whole story starts when an unknown woman gets the birth certificate for Becky Sue Turner and then walks into that Idaho DMV with that birth certificate and uses it to get an Idaho driver's license. Well, that wasn't Becky Sue Turner that did that. Becky Sue Turner is a real person with a real birth certificate, but she also had a death certificate. In fact, Becky Sue Turner had died in a house fire when she was only 2 years old. In many ways, this makes her the perfect victim for someone who wants to steal an identity. She had not lived long enough to create any paper trail, and obviously, she was not going to notice if someone else was using her ID to do things like get driver's licenses or credit cards or take out loans or anything along those lines. unclear how Laurie came to know about Becky Sue Turner, but we do have a notion of how Laurie came up with this in the first place. I mean, what we've got going on here, I think is pretty obvious at this point. Whoever Laurie Ruff is, she's not Laurie Ruff, and she wasn't Laurie Kennedy, and she wasn't Becky Sue Turner. She was someone else, and at some point, she decided she was going to become a new person. And she figured out, if I take this person, Becky Sue Turner, if I can get a hold of her birth certificate, I can use that to get an ID, and I can use that ID to then get a new identity, which I can use to get things like a Social Security card. And in many ways, it's a brilliant scheme. If you want to become a new person, this is a brilliant way to do it. But how did Laurie know to do something like this? And it turns out there's a book. You can buy a book that will help you become a new person. So, Alice, if you ever decide you want to run off, this is about to tell you how to do it. There's a manual.
There's a manual? Is that what you're telling me? That's really, wow. Please tell me more, actually.
So in the 1970s, there was a California publisher called Eden Press, and Eden Press published books about subjects that one might consider taboo. Those of you who grew up in the 90s might remember the Anarchist Cookbook. That was something that every high school student wanted to read. It tells you how to make like Molotov cocktails and bombs and that kind of thing. Well, if Eden Press had been around in the 90s, they would have been publishing the Anarchist Cookbook. And at the time, they published a book called The Paper Trip. The object of the paper trip was to help people who wanted to dodge the draft do so by creating an entirely new identity. But with the Vietnam War winding down in the early 70s and the draft falling out of favor altogether, the book was primarily used by people who, for whatever reason, needed and wanted a new identity. And the book taught people how to engage in something that's come to be called ghosting, which is when someone steals the identity of a dead person, preferably, as in this case, a young child. So ghosting, not like where you just disappear out of somebody's life. That's a relatively new definition of that. But in this case, almost where you are becoming a person who is dead. So you're almost becoming their ghost, which is where this ghosting term comes from. So the book taught prospective ghosters to conduct their efforts across state lines and in small towns. So basically the idea was, if you're going to do this, go across state lines. Don't do this in the state you're from. Go to some small town. Figure out somewhere you can go in a small town from a place you're not from to get some documentation. And the reason for this was, at the time, in the 70s and the 80s and really in the 90s, and not until relatively recently, everyone relied on paper records that were most likely kept in some state capital far away in the middle of a vault that nobody ever went to. So there was a strong possibility that local record keepers would never cross-reference a birth certificate and a death certificate. So they would never know that someone who had a birth certificate also had passed away. So if you could acquire this birth certificate, if you could walk in and somehow convince them to give you a copy of a birth certificate of someone who was deceased, once you had that birth certificate in hand, you could cross state lines again and use it to get ID from a different state that was unlikely to question the document, and even if they did, would have no way to check without getting in touch with the registrar or the probate judge from some other state. So remember, states have these reciprocity things where the whole idea is they want to make it easy for their citizens, if they move to a new place, to be able to get a new ID. So if you move from, say, California to Virginia, and you want to get a Virginia driver's license, you're able to do that. They're going to honor your California driver's license and give you a Virginia driver's license. Now they might be able to run some record checks on you, but I'll just go ahead and tell you, and I'm always shocked by this, it is more difficult than you would think, even today, to check the records of a person and get their records from every state. You know, it's easy for us in law enforcement if we want to find out the records for somebody in the state we're in to do so. But if we want to get their records from Washington, you'd think that would be easy. You'd think there'd be some database. But honestly, it's pretty hard. And this, in the 70s and the 80s, worlds more difficult. Almost impossible to be able to do that.
Absolutely, Brett. I think we see this even in our jobs, that oftentimes the record keeper is someone who is a real person that you have to call, and they're sitting in the basement and they have like all the archives for the last 100 years. And it's amazing how we can call them nowadays, and we often do in the investigative stage of our cases, but if you were to walk in and request these items, this one person who essentially acts almost like a librarian of these records, all they have to do, and they're probably pretty excited to pull a record for someone because it doesn't happen that often, because they are a keeper of records that usually are so old that people have forgotten about them, have no use for them. The marriage records, the divorce records, the birth records, that their job is almost just to pull the records, not even to themselves do the check. We see this in law enforcement. They're just like, oh, we found the record. And they don't even ask to see a badge or anything. They just say, where can I send it? So I agree with you. It's surprisingly easy to get records for somebody else.
And those of you who are lawyers, if you've ever tried to wave into the bar in a new state, and you have to get records from every place you ever lived. You know, you got to get your driver's records from every place you ever lived. It's actually really hard. And you would think it wouldn't be, but it's actually difficult to pull all that documentation together, even today in 2022. And at the time, yeah, basically impossible. And this book became this sort of underground bestseller for people who wanted to disappear. And it wasn't just ordinary people. Notably, the KGB was said to be a fan of this method, and there is at least one recorded instance of the arrest of a KGB spy who had used this book to establish himself in the United States. His name was Christopher John Boyce, also known as the Falcon. And my recollection is the way they caught him, and if I'm making this up, somebody correct me, but the way they caught him was he was a big time falconer, and he was really into falconry, and he becomes a KGB spy. He moves over to the United States. He gets a new identity. He becomes this spy, but the allure of falconry was too great. And so after some period of time, he gets back into falconry. But there are only so many people in falconry. It's kind of a small world, the falconry world. And someone recognizes him and realizes that this guy who's claiming to be this one person is actually this other person. And that's how he ends up going down. We should do a show on him. That'd probably pretty interesting, but
that sounds fascinating. Actually, I was like, why are you telling about that story here? That needs to be a standalone episode.
In any event, the FBI estimates that more than 75,000 people have used the paper trip to establish a new identity since it was first published. Alice, I think I speak for everyone when I say it has been a rough 2.5 years between COVID and war and everything else that's going on. We all have a lot of stress in our lives, and that stress is unique to us, and the way we handle it should be unique to us. And that's where BetterHelp comes in. Whether you're struggling with grief, relationships, or stress, or having trouble sleeping or meeting goals, online therapy might be for you. BetterHelp is a secure online therapy that offers video, phone, and even live chat sessions with a licensed professional therapist. BetterHelp will assess your needs and match you with your own accredited therapist, and you'll be matched in under 48 hours.
Absolutely, Brett. BetterHelp will get you a broad range of expertise, which may not be available in your area. And the service is available for clients worldwide. You'll get timely and thorough responses. Plus, you can schedule weekly video or phone sessions because BetterHelp is committed to facilitating great therapeutic matches. So they make it easy and free to change therapists if you need it. Visit betterhelp.com/prosecutors and join the over 2 million people who have taken charge of their mental health with the help of an experienced professional. The Prosecutors is sponsored by BetterHelp, and our listeners get 10% off their first month of online therapy at betterhelp.com/prosecutors. That's betterhelp.com/prosecutors. Brett, let's talk about something that I know is dear to both of our hearts, and that is what to do about big expenses and having a lot of debt. That's why we're excited about our new sponsor, Credit Karma. Are you paying down old credit card debt? Well, a personal loan could be your solution. Loans usually come with fixed monthly payments, making them a simple way to help pay off your credit cards. Plus, loans usually have lower interest rates than credit cards do, and Credit Karma can help you find the best option for you. Credit Karma uses your credit data to find loan offers that are personalized to you, so you can have a better idea of what loan amount you can get approved for.
Credit Karma will even show you your chances of approval, so you can choose between loan offers that you're more likely to get approved for and apply with more confidence. Comparing loan offers on Credit Karma is 100% free, won't affect your credit scores, and could save you money. With Credit Karma, you can apply with more confidence today. Are you ready to apply? Head to creditkarma.com/loan offers to see personalized offers. That's creditkarma.com/loan offers to find the right loan for you.
The Prosecutors podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Most of you listening right now are probably multitasking. Yep, while you're listening to me talk, you're probably also driving, cleaning, exercising, or maybe even getting grocery shopping done. But if you're not in some kind of moving vehicle, there's something else you can be doing right now. Getting an auto quote from Progressive Insurance. It's easy, and you could save money by doing it right from your phone. Drivers who save by switching to Progressive save over $700 on average, and auto customers qualify for an average of 7 discounts. Discounts for having multiple vehicles on your policy, being a homeowner, and more. So just like your favorite podcast, Progressive will be with you 24/7, 365 days a year, so you're protected no matter what. Multitask right now. Quote your car insurance at Progressive.com to join the over 27 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National annual average insurance savings by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2020 and May 2021. Potential savings will vary. Discounts not available in all states and situations.
I mean, it seems as soon as it's laid out, it makes a lot of sense. But to have this kind of manual paper guide to lead the average person along the path of how to do this, like a how-to guide, makes complete sense that Laurie or whoever she is would know the steps to take in order to accomplish this sort of grand identity heist. Now, let's talk about some prosecutor angles. Did Laurie commit a crime? Technically, she didn't hurt anyone but herself, right? She walked into, back in 1988, she walks into the California registrars and asks for the copy of a birth certificate for someone who's dead, someone who died as a child. There wasn't really any harm there, so to speak. That person's life had already ended, and they didn't have heirs or probably an estate or any sort of kind of legacy that would have been harmed or taken over by this person who obtained her identity. And then from there, she earns her own things, right? She's the one who gets the GED. She's the one who gets the business administration degree. So other than kind of this new identity, did Laurie commit a crime when she obtained the birth certificate of Becky Sue Turner when in fact she was not Becky Sue Turner? Possibly. So even though she didn't kill anyone or steal Becky Sue Turner's estate or money or inheritance, anything that Becky Sue may have had, there is such thing as aggravated identity theft. That is exactly what it sounds like. It's where you take the identity of someone else using identifiers that belong to a real person, their name, their date of birth, their address, sometimes it's affiliated with credit card numbers, anything that is tied to a real person, and use it for the purposes of assuming that identity in order to get something you want can qualify as aggravated identity theft. We see this a lot even with like the hacking of computer systems for big companies where they store a lot of our data, right? They may not trying to become Brett or Alice when they take our name and our dates of birth, but they are trying to use our likeness in whatever sort of hacking mechanism that they need, right? That's where a lot of these spam robocalls come from, is because they know something about you and they try to target you in that way, even if they're not trying to reach into my bank account to take my money by, in the first instance. And so that certainly is a possibility here. What do you think, Brett?
Yeah. Now, it's interesting talking about aggravated identity theft, and that's a federal crime. And what's interesting about, you think about the paper trail, for instance, for a very long time, these kind of crimes were all handled on a state level. So there might be some sort of fraud count you could catch in the state. And maybe if you committed some sort of fraud, you could, face something like that on the federal as well. But there really wasn't a statute. So when Laurie did this, it actually wasn't maybe as illegal as it is now. But at some point with the birth of the internet and sort of the skyrocketing of people stealing people's identity, this law was enacted. I believe it was in 2004 that aggravated identity theft became a federal crime. Usually you have to do something else with it, but assuming someone else's identity, there's not much more you'd have to do. If you use that identity in any way to open a mortgage or get a credit card or whatever you're doing, that's going to be a fraud because you're not the person you're claiming to be, and so you're going to be on the hook for this as well. So this crime has certainly made ghosting a much more dangerous thing to do. When Laurie first did it, she probably wouldn't be on the hook for this, and it's a real open question what exactly she would face if she would face anything. And I guess that brings us to the question of why. Why did Laurie do this, and who? Who is Laurie? Well, let's start with the why. There are a lot of theories about why Laurie did this, and they get sort of more conspiratorial and complex as you go. The first is that Laurie was a battered woman on the run. Some have speculated that Laurie could have been someone who was fleeing an abusive spouse or boyfriend. And there are programs that are specifically set up for women to disappear and establish a new identity when they are in a particularly bad situation, far away from the abusive boyfriends and husbands that threaten their lives. There are even people who suggested that Maura Murray was involved in something like this, and that Maura decided to disappear due to some abusive situations in her life. I mean, this is something that comes up in that case. Here, when you have Laurie actually establishing a new identity, I mean, look, this is the thing that we've talked about 1,000 times before. That is a theory in every single missing persons case we do actually happening. Laurie is doing the thing that people have suspected that Brandon Lawson and Maura Murray, Brian Schaefer, I mean, everybody that's ever disappeared, Ben McDaniel, every disappearance case we've done, someone has suggested, well, maybe they just decided to start a new life. We have this here. This is an actual case where someone decided to start a new life, to assume a new identity, to move to a new place where no one knew who she was, and never talk about her past again. So, I mean, everything that you see in those other cases, you have to kind of wonder, is that what's happening here? So the battered woman theory is one that people have wondered about. Could Laurie have taken advantage of the system at the time, read the paper trip, and realized I can start a new life far away from this abuse?
I know it's hard. It seems difficult to believe when you're actually facing the runaway theory. right? We kind of spin those theories up when we have nothing that points to it here, but here we have it, and it seems difficult to believe that the reason Laurie did all she did was because she was a battered woman on the run. Possibly, but let's talk about another theory that kind of draws in that 402 months number that we saw on the paper that she scribbled on. Was she a criminal escaping from the law? After all, she has this number of months, and sentences are calculated in months, not years. The number for the police and a contact information for a lawyer made the idea that Laurie was a criminal escaping from the law particularly attractive upon first blush. But as we discussed, this theory seems to fall apart upon closer inspection. Is it possible for Laurie to have been so horrible a criminal as to draw a more than 30-year sentence, but seemingly leave no trace in the system of her escape, or to have any behavior repetition later on in her life? Whatever sort of criminal she was to gain the 402-month sentence, whether it was drugs or violence or identity theft for that. I mean, I can't imagine an identity theft crime holding such a hefty sentence, but you would think those would be part of who she was, and that in the years following her original sentence, there'd be some sort of inkling or something in her behavior that would point you to the criminal she was before. And as far as we can see, other than her identity theft of others, which just resulted in her having new identities rather than stealing, say, their money, there's really no indication that she was a criminal.
And I just think it's impossible. I just don't think it's possible that she could have been a criminal. I just don't think there's any way that she could have committed any kind of serious crime and left no trace in the system. It just doesn't make sense. People fall through the cracks. I get that, but...
And Brett, you know, we talk about fugitives a lot, and we have a lot in our past episodes. Remember, even if this is a state or local crime that she has been sentenced for, and this is a state sentence, let's say, the feds can be brought in, especially when there's a dangerous criminal on the loose that the state and local law enforcement officers don't feel like they have the resources in order to find someone who they think is maybe at large across state lines. They'll bring in the U.S. Marshals, they'll bring in the FBI, and the kind of intelligence and capabilities and resources for these agencies is quite massive. If they want to find you, they can find you oftentimes. Just by changing your name and the way you look is not enough to run in most cases. I mean, almost every fugitive case I have, I'm trying to think of one where we really just couldn't find someone, and sometimes it was because administratively they fell through the cracks. But if they are on the hunt for you with all the warrants that they can get out on a fugitive, they will find you eventually.
Yeah, it's really, really hard to believe that something like that wouldn't have happened in this circumstance. I mean, I just have to keep going back to this sentence. Now, let me say this. There is one possibility, and that's that she, had written a lot of bad checks or something. Let's imagine that she'd written a ton of bad checks and was facing like 100 counts, and maybe for each count, she was facing 6 months in jail. But when she added them all up, she got to 402 months. And so in her mind, she thought, I can't believe this. I'm facing 40 years in jail or whatever. And in reality, of course, as anybody who's been in the system knows, if you're facing 100 counts for a year apiece, you're going to serve a year because they're all going to run concurrently to each other. So you're not gonna actually serve 40 years in prison or whatever. So maybe she was confused. Maybe she just thought that something like this would happen to her if she ended up with a sentence like this. If it's real, I mean, if this is a real sentence that she was facing, yeah, it is hard to get that kind of sentence. It is really difficult. So whatever you did would have to be very serious. So if you disappeared, Alice is right. The marshals are coming into it. You're going to be on the FBI's most wanted list. I mean, people are going to be looking for you. They're going to have your fingerprints. They're going to have your pictures. And after you died 10 years later, they would have been able to find you. It's just, if that were true, they would have been able to find her. And at the end of the day, I think this is just a theory that it just doesn't hold up. It's so attractive for all the reasons we talked about, but I just don't think it's possible. So let's talk about what is obviously the truth, and that's that Laurie is a spy, probably even a KGB agent like we talked about before. And you gotta think, I mean, Laurie's past is so well hidden, her new identity so secure, that many have expressed a belief that she must have worked for the CIA. And I just want to remind you, Laurie died in 2010. And this story became a relatively big story for all the reasons you would imagine. People really looked into this. There were private detectives looking at this. There were a lot of sleuths looking at this, trying to figure out who she was, and no one could do it. No one could figure out who she was. So she had done an incredible job of hiding her past, and it made a lot of people think she must be a spy. Maybe she works for the CIA. Maybe she's a Russian defector. Maybe she's an agent for the FSB, which is the new KGB, or some other foreign service. Maybe she's a German spy or French spy. I mean, who knows what she is? I mean, this is pure James Bond stuff. And it's, a little unclear what exactly her role would have been in the middle of Texas, hanging out at the Bible study and getting her business degree. Don't know why any of those foreign services would be interested in her in that circumstance. But, the ways of espionage are never obvious. Sort of a sub-possibility here is she was in the witness protection program, something along those lines, some other basically governmental effort to hide who she was, whether it's because she's a spy or because she testified against someone in the mob or whatever. Let your imagination run crazy. Could be anything, but they're just people who thought this is so effective, what she did, she must have had help from some sort of government agency.
But nothing about her life tends to support that, right? If you're in some undercover organization or you're a spy, there's usually then there's uses for what you did. And really, it sounds like she was really unraveling and spiraling downwards from the time that she met her husband to her untimely end. She wasn't going off on these unexplained trips and meeting up with people she should have no business knowing. Rather, she seemed like a very paranoid individual who became more and more insular as her paranoia got to her and really accelerated when she had her daughter. Those speak more to me as mental illness than it does of someone who is so undercover that those around her have mistaken her second identity as just paranoia. What's the truth then? Well, in 2016, Colleen Fitzpatrick, a forensic genealogist, reaches out to Laurie's family. Now, using Laurie's daughter's DNA, Fitzpatrick submitted the DNA to 23andMe, which is a private company where you can just submit your own DNA to find out more about your heritage, and came up with a hit on a man who might be her cousin, Michael Cassidy. The family messaged Cassidy, but he never replied. Fitzpatrick didn't give up, though, and it wasn't long until she had identified Laurie. Laurie was actually, by birth, Kimberly McLean.
So after the DNA was sequenced, Laurie's mother took a DNA test which confirmed that, in fact, she was this Kimberly McLean. Strangely, though, she would not comment on why her daughter had left to start a new life. And this is where, in some ways, this story gets even stranger. Because of all the reasons that we thought of, all the sort of conspiracies we considered, all the rabbit holes we dove down, it seems as though there is no good reason for why Laurie did what she did. Even though her mom wouldn't talk, her uncle would, and he reported that Laurie, or Kimberly, whatever you want to call her, had a ordinary childhood. Her mother, Deanne, was a stay-at-home mom. Her dad was a carpenter and a volunteer firefighter. Laurie would often ride on the fire truck. She had what seemed like a great life. Her life was perfect, basically, until she was a teenager. Her dad built her a playhouse in the backyard, and the family gathered to eat family dinner together every single night. But then when Laurie was a teenager, she did go through a trauma. Her parents divorced and things started to come apart. Her mother met a new man and married him, and they moved from Philadelphia, where she had spent her entire life, to Wincott, Pennsylvania. No idea where that is, but I can tell you it's not Philadelphia. And at this point, Laurie does begin to rebel. In 1986, she turned 18, and she immediately moved out of the house 30 minutes away. But apparently, that wasn't far enough. And one day, she goes to see her mom, and she tells her, this is goodbye. She's leaving for good, and that they should not look for her because they won't find her. And she made good on that promise in a way that I'm sure no one could even imagine. What happened over the next 2 years, no one knows. But in 1988, she turned up in Idaho on the other side of the country with a new name, Becky Sue Turner.
It's amazing that we actually know what happened and that it's so boring.
I know.
Right? I mean, in the sense that it was nothing dramatic. She wasn't abused, a battered teenager who got sold into, human trafficking or something, and then ran away and assumed a new identity because her pimp was after her for the money she owed, something like that, which sadly is a story that is all too common and ones we see in our line of work. Rather, it kind of sounds like it was really difficult for her when her parents divorced, and this, what is I wouldn't say it's that surprising of a reaction she has at age 18 with a new stepfather, with, maybe her perfect family that she envisioned would be forever breaking apart, that she would react in this way at 18. But what's surprising is that she followed through with this lie all the way until her death as a grown woman with a daughter herself, that she never backed off from it and said, well, okay, maybe it was a lot at 18, but now I'm a grown woman and have perspective on life. I don't need to be running from anyone. There's no one to run from. That's the mystery to me, is that she kept it a secret for all these years when there was no reason to keep the secret. No one was trying to keep her down or trying to make her pay or trying to drag her back home. They just were there.
And I wondered, when I read this, could there have been some abuse going on? Could this new man in her mom's life, maybe he did abuse her, but I couldn't find any proof of that. I couldn't find anybody who said that happened. Obviously, it could have been a secret and we don't know about it, but it's pure speculation. We can speculate that something like that happened, but we don't have any proof of it. And I think it is really important to think about this story because what you said is so true. This is boring. And honestly, I think most of life and most mysteries, when you get down to it, are boring. I think the actual answer is always going to be more boring than whatever adventure people develop in their minds when they're thinking about this case. And I mentioned Maura Murray earlier, and you see this in the Maura Murray community. I mean, you have people who think she was a DEA informant, that she was working undercover to break up some drug ring, and that's what took her to New Hampshire, and she was murdered by the cartel, right? That's not what happened. Or that she, like we mentioned the battered women thing, that she left to start a new identity and that she was using some organization to escape her abusive boyfriend or her father. I mean, I guess maybe that's possible, but chances are it's not true, just like it wasn't true in this case. And people have even mentioned the CIA when it comes to Maura, that Maura decided to become a spy, and this was the way she disappeared off the face of the earth. She did this, and now she's like, in Tehran now, getting nuclear secrets or something. And in reality, none of those things happened. In reality, she probably ended up either being murdered by someone that saw this as an opportunity, or as we've said before, she died of exposure in the woods. We talked about Brandon Lawson, and we did the update a couple weeks ago on Brandon Lawson, where he was found not a couple miles away from his truck where it was abandoned. That's where his body was found. There wasn't any big conspiracy. There wasn't any big effort to remove his body from the scene. He just went into the wilderness and died of exposure. In so many of these cases, the actual answer is simple and straightforward. And even here, where you have somebody who actually did decide to disappear, who actually started a new life, who assumed a new identity, who kept it secret for all those years. The reality is she just decided to do that. Wasn't a big thing. You know, she just decided at some point she wanted to be this person. And I think what happened, I don't know if there was any mental illness underlying this. I do think, though, that keeping this secret for all these years really aided her. And you saw the developing paranoia and just the fear that she was going to be found out. The fear that her lie was going to sort of collapse around her, that really, it was one of those things, I think, you know, and I hate to step out on limbs when you're talking about people's lives that you don't really know, but it feels like she had the perfect life. Finally, she had the life she wanted, and she was so afraid she was going to lose it that she kind of destroyed it on her own. She was so afraid she was going to lose her husband. She was so afraid she was going to lose her daughter that in the being afraid of it, the paranoia overtook her, and she ended up creating this self-fulfilling prophecy where everything collapsed around her. Even though she had decided to build this new life, this perfect new life with this perfect new identity, with this perfect past, it wasn't enough.
That's so tragic, and I think there's probably a lot of truth in that, especially with the growing paranoia that you saw when her daughter was born. Sometimes the lie itself is what eats at us, right? We see, again, we see this a lot where those of our targets, subjects, what have you, those who lie, they can't ever tell enough lies to get out of where they are, and it becomes a more and more desperate place for them, and we see them act as if they are a rat backed into a corner. In a lot of ways, Laurie acted at the end of her life like she had been backed into a corner when no one was backing her into a corner. Her former family wasn't coming and trying to search for her. Her daughter and her ex-husband were there for her, but somehow they had become the enemy when in fact, I think you're right, that this is exactly what she wanted was a new life, and she got that new life. So this is also tragic, but also so telling when now that we get to see a real life example of someone who ran away to start a new life and just disappeared seemingly into thin air. That's what happened by all accounts to Kimberly McLean when she left home at 18, is she disappeared into thin air. And we see and get to actually follow her life in a way we can't in the cases where we theorize that the person ran away for a new life. Because I think by seeing the reality, we see how unlikely this theory is in a lot of other cases.
And it has become much more difficult to do what Kimberly did. The whole paper trail thing, the ghosting thing, you could do that back in the 70s and the 80s. I'm not going to say it's impossible to do it now, because as we said, databases are still pretty bad and paper is still relied upon in a lot of places, but it's a lot harder now to create a new identity like this than it would have been at the time. So, you know, if you're trying to apply this theory to something that's happened in the last 10 years or so, probably not. But yeah, this is a crazy case. It's a tragic case. I really feel sorry for her. And whatever she was running from that led her to this path, I mean, I hate that happened, but I think it is something we can all learn from when we're thinking about these cases and we're trying to come up with sort of the craziest possible answer a lot of times that is going to lead us not to truth, but down, you know, a bunch of rabbit holes that really lead nowhere. So, well, we would love to hear what you guys think about this case. If you want to check out some of the documents from this case and the research we did, head on over to prosecutorspodcast.com. Hit us up at prosecutorspod on all your social media. Email us, prosecutorspod@gmail.com. Leave a comment on YouTube if you're tired of the ads. Feel free to join us on Patreon, where for as little as $3 a month, you can hear ad-free episodes and join us on live, get vocals and all those things. CrimeCon is getting closer and closer. Those of you who are still thinking about going to Vegas, I hope you will join us. We're really looking forward to that. We can't wait to meet some of you guys, play some blackjack with you, or whatever your preferred way to lose money in Vegas is. We would love to take part with you. Well, Alice, do you have anything else to add before we sign off for tonight?
No, but you just got me excited about CrimeCon, so I look forward to seeing a lot of y'all there.
Can't wait for CrimeCon. Looking forward to seeing you guys. But until then, we will be back next week with a new case, new questions, and new answers. But until we see you on the other side, I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors.
Thank you for waking us up. Sorry.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Okay. You ready?
Yeah, I'm ready. Wait.
Today on the Prosecutors. What?
Sorry. I pressed the button and I shouldn't have. And now everything's fine now. Sorry. No, everything's fine. Sorry.
Okay.
No, it's all good. I'm sorry.
Good. Okay, that's fine. Okay, here we go.
Stream the biggest movies and TV shows for free on PlutoTV. Watch movies like Titanic and G.I. Joe: The Rise of Cobra, plus TV shows like CSI and Star Trek: The Next Generation. Starting this month, check out the 24/7 Stargate channel exclusively on PlutoTV. Plus hundreds of channels and thousands of movies and TV shows absolutely free. Download the free Pluto TV app on your favorite streaming device and start watching today.